of kind of our history story of Citizens Climate Lobby, not necessarily because it's such a good story, but because it's very relevant to how we're doing what we're doing. Then I want to walk you through a specific methodology that we're using to generate political will. The fundamental view we take of politics is that politicians don't create political will, they respond to it. And so what our obligation as citizens to do is to create so much political will, it's impossible for them not to do the right thing on the climate. Okay? And so we're not guessing, is the good news. We've actually replicated a model that has already been demonstrated to work with Congress, which is who we need to take action. And I'm going to walk you through that model. I'm going to walk you through a specific piece of legislation that we're working on. So you can see the legislative proposal that we're working on. And then there'll be plenty of times for you to interact and ask questions. You know, being talked to death is a terrible death, so we try and make sure there's plenty of times to be broken up so that the likelihood of that decreases as much as possible. Okay, so what are we dealing with? Well, part of what we're dealing with is there are 2,300 paid lobbyists in Washington, D.C. on the issue of energy and climate alone. 2,300 paid lobbyists. So that means for every one member of the House of Representatives, there's 4 people that are paid to influence them. And so that process has been quite successful, hasn't it? So, you know, what happened is for a long time, the only people who were really weighed in on what was happening with the climate were the scientists. What happened is primarily the oil companies, but then the coal companies started to see if only the scientists dominated the debate, then that was not going to be good for them in their quarterly numbers. They started investing in think tanks, and you had people like the Cato Institute, really creating some really brilliant campaigns to simply put doubt in the back of people's minds. How many of you have read or her book or seen Naomi Oreskes speak? Okay, she's the author of Merchants of Doubt. And what she documents in Merchants of Doubt is what they very successfully did was duplicated the same thing that they did with tobacco. In the tobacco, what they wanted to do was just put in the back of the mind is maybe there was a question about it. They wouldn't say absolutely no, this has nothing to do with cancer, but just have people question it. So they decided to try the exact same strategy with the climate. And so they don't say, oh, there's no chance nothing's happening, but they say things like, the planet's just going through natural cycles, don't they? And we all know that it does that, and that makes sense, doesn't it? So it's much easier to say, well, yes, the planet just seems to be going through a cycle that it's going through. And then the funniest thing about it, you know, you wonder if enough people are fact-checking. There's a guy who's a physicist named Fred Singer. And so he's a physicist, therefore that means he knows a lot more about science than I do. The extent of my scientific training is I passed high school biology. Now, you may not have passed high school biology, but I did. So perhaps I know more about science than you do. So there's no question that Fred Singer knows more about science than I do. But Fred Singer was the guy that they brought out during the tobacco hearings to say that secondhand smoke didn't cause cancer. Okay, he's a physicist, okay, but why he's called to testify, I don't know why. So then, 30 years later, he's brought in to testify that climate change isn't man-made. Same guy. So now he's suddenly more of an expert than all the climate scientists, and he was more of an expert than all the people about tobacco. So their campaign's been very successful, and oil companies make more money every quarter than almost all the other companies combined, right? So they have an unlimited amount of money to spend. So if the resolution of what's happening with the climate ends up a spending issue, we're dead. What we're betting the ranch on is you. We're betting the ranch on the human factor with respect to dealing with this issue. So what we want to offer tonight is a model for you to get your hands completely around your democracy and be able to exert the kind of influence that you want to influence. We're not for everybody. Some people would rather talk to other people about how unfair it is, how unjust and how impossible it is, and scream at the TV. And we're not for those people. We're for the people who want to say, you know what, this is my problem, I'm up to it, I'm willing to take it on, I understand it's hard, but I'm up for the task. You know, how many of you remember, well, from studying history or something, that in 1914 was the first expedition to go to the South Pole? And there was a guy named Shackleton who arranged an expedition. Here's the advertisement that he put out. And this is, in a certain sense, what we're offering you. So he says, men wanted. So in our case, we could say men or women wanted for hazardous journey. Small wages, bitter cold, Long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, but honor and recognition in case of success. So here's what we're guaranteeing you. This is going to be hard, but it might turn out. And if it turns out, we could think it was a good thing. Okay, so let me tell you the Citizens Climate Lobby story. So we were founded by a guy named Marshall Saunders. Marshall Saunders is a 72-year-old, you could say retired businessman from San Diego. He works harder than anybody I've ever met. He spent 20 years before he started Citizens Climate Lobby setting up microcredit loans in third world countries. So in microcredit, you lend to people that are so poor that nobody would ever lend them money. How much money do you lend them? $10, $20, $50. And you go into those villages, and in general, how microcredit works is you lend 5 women money at a time, and they become a little unit together. And they start a small business in their community that could be like sometimes a couple of chickens, a goat. One woman, we lent her $50, which was enough money to buy a broken sewing machine and fix it. Then they start a business in their community and lift their family up out of poverty with that business. 98% of microcredit loans are repaid. And when those loans are repaid, it goes to fund the next set of loans in the village. So once you get it started, it ends up having a remarkable impact wherever you generated it. So how many of you ever heard the name Muhammad Yunus before? Muhammad Yunus? Okay, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for founding the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. If you go on the Grameen Foundation website, you'll see that in the history of the Grameen Foundation, they've given their humanitarian awards 6 times. 5 times it was to heads of state like the Queen of Spain. 1 time it was to a retired real estate broker from San Diego. Because Marshall has personally generated over 1 million microcredit loans. So my view, I don't think everybody has to agree with me, but my view of the world is that people do want to have their life count. They want to matter. They want to give something back. They want to do something useful. And in Marshall's case, I would say, okay, you get a pass. You know, you helped out. So he's going along doing that, and then he saw An Inconvenient Truth. And how many of you saw Vice President Gore's movie? Okay, well, Marshall and I had the exact opposite reaction to that movie. First of all, I didn't want to go because I suspected we had a problem, and I didn't want to find out it was worse than I thought. And then the other thing is I was sure that Vice President Gore was going to lay a big guilt trip on me about what I wasn't doing. And so I didn't want to go. But then I went, and no, it wasn't a terrible movie. It was the best movie I'd ever seen. Because at the end of the movie, what does he say? No, you don't have to do the whole thing. Just change your light bulbs. Drive a smaller car. And I'm like, yes, I'm changing my light bulbs, I'm driving a smaller car, I'm putting my head back under the covers. Because I was convinced that this was such a big problem that it really took the big, rich, smart, connected people. You know, we regular folks couldn't fix it. You know, the good guys had to come along. So I, changed my light bulbs and went back to sleep about it. Marshall had the exact opposite reaction. He completely melted down. He saw the movie 4 times in 10 days. Because what he couldn't get out of his head was, here were millions and millions of families in Bangladesh who lifted themselves out of poverty. That's one of the most low-lying countries in the world. Any rise in sea level jeopardizes their ability to grow crops or live. So here you have someone who goes, wow, I generated 1 million microcredit loans, and maybe that's wiped out because of what's happening with climate change. So at that instant, he decided he would spend the rest of his life to work on climate change. So what he did was he asked Vice President Gore to train him as a climate project presenter. Are any of you trained in that presentation? Anybody here? Okay. Maybe we could all serve that as a reminder as to please turn your phone back on in a while. Anyway, so the climate project presentation that Vice President Gore trained so many people on around the country gave people a very good dose of the science and then showed people how they could reduce their carbon footprint. And so Marshall started doing that the way he does anything, which is fanatically. Made 43 presentations in 10 months, but about 3 presentations in started to have some serious misgivings about what he was doing. Because he was getting regular people to change their behavior, but then getting up and reading the paper in the morning. And the paper was saying that Congress had just given the oil companies multi-billion-dollar tax breaks again. So if you're kind of looking at that, well, let's say I got 25 people to change their light bulbs last night, $1 billion tax break for a oil company, how do you get that to match up? So what he realized is whose behavior he really needed to alter was Congress's. So that was kind of the bad news. I got to get Congress to change their behavior. The good news was the whole time he'd been working on microcredit, he had been doing it in partnership with an organization called Results. Have any of you ever heard of Results? Okay. Results has been lobbying with volunteer groups on the issue of poverty. And what Results actually demonstrated was that if you were organized, you were structured, and you were disciplined, and you had volunteer groups set up by congressional district, you could get Congress to do things that were entirely unpredictable. So 30 years ago, when Results started, the United States annual appropriation for dealing things like childhood immunizations, poverty, tuberculosis, malaria, things that had large amounts of the population die of either starvation or disease, our appropriation was $25 million a year. Now it's over $500 million a year. And if you talk to members of Congress on a regular basis, and we do, they'll tell you it's because of the work of the Results volunteers, that they had a structured, disciplined message. They knew how to create a relationship with their member of Congress so they could work with their member of Congress as a partner in dealing with legislation. So Marshall said, okay, simple. All I have to do is find an environmental group that's using this as methodology, and we can get good federal legislation passed. So he found a lot of great things people doing a lot of great things. I know a lot of people here have worked with the Sierra Club. At some point, we're going to have to put statues up around the country for all the work the Sierra Club has done to get the coal-fired plants stopped. That's a remarkable, remarkable achievement. But what he couldn't find is anybody that had a specific plan to get federal legislation passed. So 3.5 years ago, he started Citizens Climate Lobby, and all we did is said, okay, we're going to take a system, an approach, a methodology that's already proven to be successful with Congress, and we're simply going to move it over to the climate issue. Okay, so let me just stop and see if you have any questions about that so far. Okay. Okay, so there are some really, really big things that, that there are to deal with respect to what's happening with the planet. You know, every time the scientists go to measure the rate at which the glaciers are receding, the data gets worse, not better, doesn't it? You know, in some cases, that's not inconsequential. You know, Glacier National Park used to have, what, 120 glaciers, and now it has 20? Not that big a deal. That's a tourism issue. But let's think about some place like Peru. Peru gets all of their fresh water from one glacier. The most recent measurement on Peru's glacier says it'll be gone in 10 years. So that means a country without access to fresh water. Most of Asia gets their fresh water from glaciers, right? So that's a potential big problem. One of our groups is made up entirely of PhD candidates at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So they give us a lot of information about what's happening in the ocean. And mostly what people focus on is the polar bear's loss of habitat, which not everybody agrees with me, but I think it's tragic. For us to just watch that happen, I think is tragic. But the thing that they keep pointing to us now is there's so much acidification in the ocean. It's creating all kinds of problems. They're beginning to see evidence of things like the shells of plankton breaking down. And the plankton are what in the ocean? And the bottom of the food chain. Yeah, so if you lose the top of the food chain, a polar bear, tragic. But if you lose the bottom of the food chain, and we lose the ocean as a food source, holy cow. Okay? Okay, now there's a couple of things that I want to say that are really important about this. I'm going to get into our structure in a little bit. But what we do is the first Saturday of every month we have a call and we have a guest speaker. So we've had a lot of scientists, we've had economists. We had a guy in April named Rob Willers who teaches at Berkeley. And he wrote a paper called Apocalypse Soon, Dire Messaging is Counterproductive. And here's what his study showed. His study showed is that when you just lay out the facts of what's happening with climate change, for most people, it's too much to wrap their hands around it. It seems like, you know, this big world, how could we screw up something this big? So if you just lay out the problem, in the back of people's mind, they say to themselves, you know what, I bet they're just missing something on the science. It's not that they aren't honest, good people, but they must just not have something right on the science. If you take that exact same people and you say, here's this huge problem we have, and then you add, but here's how we're going to solve it, you just added one more piece. We have this big problem, here's how we're going to solve it. Those exact same people say, wow, you really know your science. So it ends up that it's probably likely that many of us who've been working very diligently on this have been counterproductive because we've only been giving people the problem. So that's something that you and I should come to terms with, that a lot of what we have been doing might not have helped. The other piece is this. We try and pride ourselves on being an organization that's for something as opposed to people who are just against something. You know, it's easy to be against stuff. And how many of you ever, I know you hate to admit it, but how many of you ever listen to the political radio or TV talk shows or cable shows or anything? How many of you ever watch any of those or listen to them? Okay, you know, those shows are 99% about what they're against, who they hate, who's a jerk, and occasionally a little bit of policy, right? So what we try and do is force ourselves to constantly work on what we're for, what we're in favor of. So I want you to do an exercise in just a moment, and what I'd like you to do is identify something that is important in your life that you have shared with other people, that you want to make sure that is around for future generations that is potentially jeopardized by climate change. So it's something that's been important. You know, it needs to be something specific, like some particular place where it's been important. Come on in. Hi. No problem. We knew there were going to be people coming in. Some people come in, some people go. There's name tags back there. There's chairs back there. Okay, there's someone taking care of something. All right, that's part of the deal. It's part of saving the world as it goes like that, right? So there are things that have been important in your life that climate change has the jeopardy of those not being available to future generations. So let me give you a real specific example for me. When I was a little kid, my favorite thing to do in summer was to pick fresh fruit off of my neighbor's trees. And, you know, because fruit ripened on a tree doesn't taste like what you get in the store, right? So next door there were apricots, and then 2 houses down there were cherries, and across the street there were grapes, and, you know, up the hill there was plums. And, you know, when you're a little kid, it's great that you're getting the fruit, but half the adventure is jumping over the fence and not knowing if the old man with the rake is there or their dog. You know, so not only getting the fruit, but escaping, right? Makes it taste twice as good. Anyway, by far my favorite is if you went across the street and up a hill, there was a plum tree. And there was no fence, and bless you. So all you had to do was step off the sidewalk, and you know, you got those big purple plums, you know, and they just bite it in your mouth, and your whole mouth starts to water. Well, I have been planting fruit trees in my backyard for 20 years because I have 3 children in their 20s. I wanted my grandkids to have the experience of picking fresh fruit off the tree. And so I put one of those plum trees in 10 years ago, and it made really good plums. And then 3 years ago, it stopped making plums. So I have a really good nursery by my house, and usually if you take them a branch or a leaf, you take it and they say, oh, here's the problem, and here's what you should do. So I went in with the plum tree, and they said, your problem is it doesn't get cold enough in the winter in San Diego for the plum tree to go through the cycle it needs to go to make plums. So if San Diego's winters continue to be as warm as they have been recently, that plum tree will never make plums again. So I want to just give it as an example. So, you know, I've been working on this project for years, so my grandkids can pull a plum tree off that tree. It probably won't happen. So you can't always tie things to climate change, can you? It's dangerous to say this specific thing always. So I'm saying things that could be jeopardized by climate change. So, and I'd like to see if you could find something specific. So sometimes people say, I love the beach, or I love the forest. No, we're not talking about something as general as the forest or the beach, but a particular beach. Like maybe one that you went with your grandpa to or something, or a particular hike that you used to take with your brother or sister. Something that's specific. So anyway, grab someone next to you and say, you're my partner, and both of you find something that you could not possibly be available to share for future generations because of what's happening with climate change. Make sure you have someone to talk to. If you don't have someone to talk to, raise your hand and we'll find your partner. So if it has to be 3 people, it's fine, but make sure everybody has someone to talk to or raise your hand. Okay, thank you very much. Go ahead and wrap that up. I want to give you an example of somebody's kind of response to that, even though it's a little bit different take. During the Apollo mission in 1969, astronaut Rusty Schweickart was let out of the capsule on an umbilical cord. Usually NASA keeps the astronauts compulsively busy up there, but a peculiar thing happened to Schweickart. Just as he emerged from the capsule, something went wrong within the capsule. Both Mission Control in Houston and the remaining astronauts had to concentrate on the problem. This left Rusty all alone, floating around Mother Earth in complete cosmic silence. During this time, Rusty had 2 profound conversion experiences. He looked back at Mother Earth, a shining gem against a totally black backdrop, and he realized everything he cherished was on that gem: his family and land, music and human history with its folly and its grandeur. He was so overcome that he wanted to hug it and kiss that gem like a mother does her firstborn child. Compassion flowed through him. Trained as a jet fighter pilot, he was a typical macho man, but a breakthrough of something bigger came washing over him at that moment in space. Schweikert's second awakening in space was a political one. He was a red, white, and blue American who believed that he'd always been taught that the world was divided between the communist world and the free world. Yet while floating around Mother Earth, he saw that rivers flowed indiscriminately between Russia and Europe, that ocean currents served communist, socialist, and capitalist nations alike, that clouds did not stop at borders to test for political ideology, and that there were no nations. Nations exist in the mind of the human race alone. On returning to NASA, Schweikert was not debriefed by any spiritual director about his mystical experiences. He confesses to having wandered around in a state of stupor for 6 months, bumping into walls, asking himself repeatedly this one question: why did God do this to me? Finally, he concluded that God did this through him so that others might hear the message. What message? Compassion, interdependence, shared beauty on this shining, glistening planet. The holy earth. We must take such care of it. It must take such care of us. This side of heaven, we are each of us so nearly all one has. There is darkness all around us, yet between us there is just enough light to get by. We're going to try and work on connecting with people on their love for particular things about the planet. And we're going to function from the point of view that there is common ground all of us can find with other people. If you listen to TV, they're always going to try and give you the conflict view of the world, and that everybody's polar on this side and everybody else is on the polar side of that side. And certainly the coal and oil industry is going to spend everything they can to keep the status quo. We're going to bet the ranch that that kind of compassion exists in every kind of person we need to reach. You know, how many of you have heard of Senator Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma? We've heard of Jim Inhofe. Okay. Senator Jim Inhofe is kind of the poster child of everybody who says crazy things about the climate. So most people demonize him for good reason, because he says stupid things. He'll say to anybody who will listen to him that global warming is the greatest farce ever imposed upon the American public. Okay? So he's the kind of the person, if you talk to most environmental organizations, they say, who's the enemy? Jim Inhofe typifies them. We have a group, a Citizens Climate Lobby, a group at the University of Oklahoma. So their response to Jim Inhofe is, we should sit down with him and see how he could be part of the solution. So they asked for the first meeting at his office. They've met with his staff twice. They haven't met with Inhofe yet. But I think it's just a little bit of a different view of things of how can we have Inhofe be part of the solution rather than he's the enemy. So here's how the first meeting went. The meeting was scheduled for 20 minutes. Here's 5 women in their late 50s, early 60s, faculty at the University of Oklahoma. Here's a young 20-something-year-old staffer from Oklahoma. Supposed to be a 20-minute meeting, lasts an hour. That's one of our indications that things are working the way they should, is when they ask us to stay longer. The 5 women are walking out with the young staffer after the meeting, and the staffer says to him, you know, people think Senator Inhofe's a bad guy. He's not a bad guy. He said, people think Senator Inhofe eats children. He doesn't eat children. So I get a debrief meeting from every single meeting we have with members of Congress. Inhofe's is the only one that says senators said to have not eat children. When Marshall asked me to come be part of Citizens Climate Lobby, when we talked about what we were trying to do, he gave me pretty broad discretion about that I could do whatever I saw needed to be done. The one thing he asked is, he said, do you think we can use Gandhi as a model for working on this? And he said, do you think we can use Gandhi not because he's an inspiring, important historical figure, but he said because I think we're up against something like ending slavery. I think we're up against something like getting the women to vote, and so we need to think in the biggest possible terms. You know, Gandhi, before he went to India, was in South Africa, and he asked for a meeting with General Smuts. So General Smuts was a big man, over 6 feet tall, his full uniform on. In comes Gandhi, what, about 5 feet tall, in that white thing, you know, his big diaper. So here's General Smuts in his uniform, in comes Gandhi. Gandhi comes in, he says, I'm here to tell you that I intend to oppose your government. Smuts looks down to him and goes, really? Anything else I should know? And Gandhi says, oh yes, I intend to prevail. And Smuts says, and how do you plan to do that? And Gandhi says, with your help. And that is very much the approach we try and take with the people who have not been included in the discussion, is how can they be part of what we're trying to solve here? Okay, So how does this system approach methodology work? Well, what we do is the first Saturday of each month, we have a conference call with all of our US and Canadian groups. It looks like the first group outside of North America is going to be in Great Britain, but right now we're concentrated in the US and Canada. And we do three things in that call. The first part of that call is educational. And so we've had a lot of scientists. Dr. James Hansen, who I think most people consider to be the country's leading climatologist, has been on. Richard Somerville was on last December, who was the lead author for IPCC 2007. We've had a lot of economists. And it's interesting when we have economists on, they all say the same message, which is if you want less of something, the fastest way to get less of it is to make it more expensive. And the case they constantly point to is cigarette smoking. Half of our country used to smoke. Now less than 20% do. And the economists insist that was because of a pricing factor. They talk about an economist called Pigou and a Pigouvian tax. Have you ever heard of a Pigouvian tax? Pigouvian tax? Okay, well, here's what Pigou said. Funny name, but real guy. He said there's sometimes when the market fails. And what he means is when the market fails, there's times where the cost of certain goods don't really reflect their real cost. And cigarettes being clearly one of those. And without a doubt, oil and coal being the biggest failure ever. Right. So if you were going to really assess the actual cost of oil, you have to add in the $2 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan, don't you? Oh, yeah. How much would gas be per gallon if we factored in the actual cost? Because we're not there without oil, are we? And if you were going to factor in the real cost of coal, and the enormous health effects that's put on our society, it's not even close to there. So what the economists say is you have to put a cost, a price on those to bring them in line with what their real cost to society. So we've had a lot of economists on. We've had a lot of very good people on the issue of messaging. I mentioned Rob Willer, who wrote the paper, Apocalypse Soon, Dire Messaging is Counterproductive. In September, we had a guy named Mark Jacobson. Mark Jacobson has been studying 9,000 meteorological sites around the world for a long time. And what he and a partner did is actually mapped the entire world to find out everywhere we could put wind and solar installations to get all the energy we need from wind, solar, and geothermal alone in 20 years. Okay, so the work is there. He's done it. He knows all the places we can be. One of the really amazing things about going to renewable energy? Do you know that renewable energy is so much more efficient that we'll need about a third less energy when we go 100% renewable because fossil fuel energy generation is so inefficient? So it ends up, that transition is a good thing in a lot of ways. Now here's some of the things that Mr. Jacobson took into account. He took into account that there are emerging economies where people want our lifestyle, where they're going to want more energy. He took into account that the planet's adding 1 billion people over the next couple of decades. So when he said we could make the conversion in 20 years to wind, solar, and geothermal, he was taking into account a huge increase in demand of energy around the world, and also that we would be adding at least 1 billion people in the next couple of decades. We had a guy named Tony Lazarowitz a few minutes ago. He wrote the Six Americas report. Have any of you ever seen that? So what it does is it documents where different categories of Americans in. So you're probably in what he would call the alarm category. 20% of Americans are alarmed. But those people are in action, they're doing something. Another about 25 to 30% of Americans are concerned, but they don't know what to do. Those are the people we really should be talking to. Because they want to do something, they know it's a man-made problem, and but they don't know what to do. If you tell them, go do this, they'll go do it. There's another category of people who are a little bit uncertain. They think that the scientific issue is really 50-50. Not knowing that there's actually complete consensus in the scientific community on this issue. There's the disengaged, which are mostly poor people, that it's all they can do to get by in their life and don't have time to think about, do we have big problems on the planet? And then the smallest group is who? The denialists. Now, they scream so much that it seems like it's half the country, doesn't it? But it ends up it's actually the smallest category. And he says those are the last people you talk to, because if you say to them, well, everybody in the American Academy of Sciences says this. They think that there's a conspiracy with the American Academy of Sciences. And then if you say, well, it's also the Pontifical Academy of Science, they just get more paranoid and go, oh my God, this conspiracy is bigger than I thought it was. So there's very little use of your time in trying to get those people convinced out of their paranoid view of what's happening here. Okay, but all those other categories, the concerned, the uncertain, those are people we should be talking to. So every month we have, really interesting, last month, 2 weeks ago, We had a woman named Elizabeth Hayhoe. She's a climate scientist, but she's also evangelical. And so what she was doing was coaching us, how do we reach faith-based communities? How do we reach people who oftentimes aren't part of what you might call, quote, a green movement? She even talked about in Texas, where she is, if you say the planet's older than 6,000 years, game over. Yeah. So how do you talk to people who that's their view of the world? Okay? Listen, we have to think about how to include those people, not how to dismiss them because because they're crazy. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
At that point, I love the comedian was black who pulls up a fossil.
Yes, good point.
Yeah, but the devil put the fossil there.
Right. Yeah. So the first part of our program is always educational. It's not just we're trying to get more information. Information's important. But we're trying to become so broad on the issue that we can deal with any component of it. So we try and really broaden ourselves, educate ourselves. Then there's two other things we do every single month. We practice speaking about the issue. And if you spend any time around me, you're going to hear me say, you know what we should do? Go practice. Well, then what should we do? Let's go practice some more. Well, we did a bunch of that. Well, no, more time for practice. We take the point of view that it really doesn't matter what you say. It matters what people hear. So if we're failing to get a message across to people, we think we need to look over here and say, well, we need to figure out how to communicate with those people then. So every month we work on how we can communicate with other groups of people and more effective with members of Congress, the media, etc. How many of you have ever read any of Malcolm Gladwell's books? Outliers, Blink, anything like that? Okay. He says in Outliers, he discussed his research done at the Berlin Academy of Music. Researchers divided violin students into three categories: the stars, the good performers, and the ones who would become teachers but not performers. It turns out that the number one predictor of which category a violinist fell in with was the number of hours of practice. The future teachers had practiced 4,000 hours in their lifetime, the good performers 8,000 hours, and those who were categorized as stars, every single one of them had practiced at least 10,000 hours. And here's the compelling part. There wasn't a single violinist who'd practiced 10,000 hours who wasn't a star. So obviously we're not talking about you and I practicing on any of that kind of level, but we are talking about the importance of practice. A huge part of our model is successfully meeting with and developing a relationship with members of Congress. How many of you sat down face-to-face in their office with a member of Congress before? How many of you done that? Okay, well, they're usually, the reason they get elected is because they're pretty charismatic people. And you probably have a 15-minute meeting. Sometimes. If you have a 15-minute meeting with them, there's probably a good chance that they're going to talk for 13 of those 15 minutes. So that means if you come in and there's something that you want to have happen with them, you've got 2 minutes. So what we're saying is practice, 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 so that when you have your opportunity, you say the exact thing you want to say, not just something that you came to talk about that might not be relevant to what they're saying. So we're going to practice every month. And then the third thing we do is every single month we promise to take action. So again, we take this like this is generating civil rights in the country, getting women to vote. We're going to do something next month and the next month and the next month and the next month. Because we've studied the results model so much, we know a lot between those things that actually generate political will and those that don't. For instance, we know the most impactful thing you can do is sit down with your member of Congress regularly, tell them why this is important, and tell them how they can solve it and how we will generate support for them in the community. We also know that while most of the reporting has been about the impact of American newspapers losing their influence, American newspapers sway enormous clout in the political world. We know that the congressional delegation religiously reads the editorial page of the paper every day. And it's also a way where if you have a message and you construct it well, my paper, the San Diego Union, 500,000 to 1 million people see it a day. So that means it's reaching a broad audience from one place where I put something. So we work with every group. One of our staffers worked at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for 31 years. And so we work with every group to help them get published regularly in their local newspaper. Sure, we're on Facebook. Sure, we're on Twitter. Yeah, we work on all those things. But the American newspaper still makes such a huge impact that we focus on that a lot. Craig and I spent this morning over at the meeting with a member of the editorial board of the Kansas City Star. It's a way to create an enormous partnership between you and your newspaper. And it allows us to do a couple of things. One is to make a case for what can get done. But also, as you begin to develop a relationship with them, you watch the debates. They get 30-second answers, right? At some point, those candidates have to sit down with an editorial board. And that's usually going to be an hour meeting with an editorial board. They actually have a chance to ask in-depth questions. And so one of the things we're going to be asking all the American newspapers is when they sit down with them to ask every candidate, where are they with respect to the science of climate change, and where are they with how they're going to solve it, and then have that go on the record. Okay, so we focus heavily with members of Congress and with newspapers. But then we do two other things that I don't think anybody else is focusing on. And that is, we ask people to look for opportunities to reach out to people who can influence this issue that aren't part of Big Green. So we look for how we can connect with faith-based organizations. We look to speak with existing and retired military leaders. See, because if Greenpeace says, hey, Senator Roberts, here's what you should do. Senator Roberts goes, yeah, it's Greenpeace, right? But if Admiral Mullen does it, who just retired as the Joint Chiefs of Staff, it's way different, isn't it? And I don't know how much you track Mullen, but Mullen was trying to move the military so hard towards renewable energy. One of the things he had was a metric that showed how many Marines he lost for every mile they transported fuel in Afghanistan. Okay, so from him, it was a human life issue of getting to renewables. And so when we can get those people to speak out, it's a little bit different than when Greenpeace does. Okay, so that's the monthly call. Let me just stop and see if you have a question about that or anything else we've covered so far. Please. Yeah, I meant faith and military, sorry. It was actually one. Very good catch, though. It's nice to know that people pay attention. Yeah, and actually you could really easily add a third category to that, Joe, in that we also look for other opportunities where people could speak out. For instance, the group in Salt Lake City, one of the largest employers there is Kennecott Copper Mine. They're owned by Rio Tinto, which is one of the largest coal mining companies in the world. And so our group has been working with Rio Tinto and has worked their way up to the CEO of the Minerals Management Division, who actually said, yes, we do need to put a price on carbon-based fuels, and actually liked our legislative proposal a lot and said the next step would be to talk to London, where their headquarters are. Right. So we're always looking for where can we reach out to people that aren't just part of, because it's easy to pigeonhole Big Green, isn't it? Much harder to do that with faith-based leaders, military leaders, industrial leaders. Last year in Washington, D.C., when we went back for our annual conference, the scientific report we brought around was the one from the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Because, some people will try and discredit the National Academy of Sciences. I don't know how you discredit people who are volunteers who are the top people in the world. But we went into a lot of offices where we knew the member of Congress was Catholic. And, you get some of the, we're not so sure this is happening in the national cycle. We're saying, we pulled the report out and said, well, the Vatican doesn't agree with you. So we're looking for things that can influence people. And yeah?
You got anywhere with insurance companies?
The question she asked is, have you gotten anywhere with insurance companies? We haven't, but it's all over our radar. Because for those of you who've been following that side of it, you know that the insurance companies are looking at the world and saying, we can't insure this. Right. There is nothing but disasters coming that we can't insure. What have the climate scientists been saying for the last 2 to 3 decades? Warmer air holds more moisture. Moisture in the air creates weather-related events. Therefore, warmer air with more moisture will create a greater frequency and severity of weather-related events. And the insurance industry is saying we're not going to be able to cover it. Texas has been burning for a year. Minnesota's had the 100-year flood 3 of the last 5 years. Australia flooded last year. Russia didn't export wheat for the first time in 20 years because of the droughts. I mean, it's impossible to get away with. And those people, just from a business point, they're trying to pencil it out. It doesn't pencil out. Yeah. Please.
On the Saturday
calls,
yeah, how does, logistically, is that something that this circle here can listen in on, and can we invite other people? Logistically, how does that work?
Yeah, here's how it logistically works. What we try and do is we try and encourage people to get together and listen together. We think being a team is a really important part of this, because this is way too hard an issue to take on alone. I don't know how it was for you, but Lene and I were talking about earlier today when the Supreme Court put down the Citizens United decision about a year ago, saying that corporations could give unlimited amount of money to campaigns. And I'm like, this was too hard already. I give up. So we think being a team is a big part of it. So what we're going to strongly encourage you to do is get together in one place. Listen together. You can invite us. You can invite as many people as you like, even that person. Now, if you can't listen into it at that time, we record it, and we usually have it posted onto our website within a half hour after the call. But part of the reason... Are we okay? Okay.
And I think we'll be meeting at my apartment to start off.
Okay, fabulous. Which is just right up the stairs from over here.
Yeah.
So part of the reason that we want you to be there as a team is, one is so that you're developing a team so that when we go to meet with members of Congress, you can practice together. And every single month, you'll hear me at the end of the call say the first thing we want you to do is practice the laser talk. So we want someone there with you where you can actually practice the material, say it out loud a bunch of times, etc. Yeah. Other questions so far? Yeah.
I saw an email today that referred to a group that I wasn't familiar with, Monta Welch, President and founder of Interfaith Care for Creation in Columbia Climate Change Coalition. Are you familiar?
No, but we'd be real interested in speaking with them. We have put together an educational presentation that anybody could give. That the first 15 slides are statements from multiple religions around the world saying their official religion statement on climate change and what we need to do about it. Not just the Vatican, but a bunch other. And then the second part of the presentation is showing how we can convert to wind, solar, and geothermal. So again, you and I need to be clear that we can only sell, here's how we're going to make this happen, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to solve it message. We don't want to walk away from all the bad things that are happening, but we do want to be presenting with people with here's how we're going to do it. It's kind of like, you know how excited our country was when we said we were going to put a man on the moon? You know, everybody was excited about it. We need to create that kind of atmosphere of, we're going to do this remarkable thing. We're going to actually convert our energy sources to clean energy. You know, if we don't do that, you know what the alternative is to meet the energy demand? 13,000 more coal plants. 13,000 coal plants. Brutal. Yeah, so I would love to, if you have contact information, talk to them. Yeah?
I think about 3 years ago, a West Shore Energy official said that this country does not need more power plants. It needs conservation.
Okay. Yeah. There's a lot to be said for that. Yeah, there's a lot to be said for it, and there's a lot that could be done very quickly to reduce CO2 emissions with conservation. You know, the question always is, how do we get wherever we need to get fastest, is the thing we're asking. Yeah, huge gains can be made from that. There's no question about it. Other questions so far? Okay. So our organization exists for 2 reasons. One is to create the political will for a stable climate. So a lot of the structure for that is we get together on the Saturday, and then the cool thing you'll see is everybody goes and does something. So what we do is the next month we report on what happened. And what you'll see is you're not just out there alone. You'll see what the group in Richmond's doing, and the people in Alaska are doing, and the groups in Canada are doing. And so you'll see that there are all these people who are in a very focused, disciplined way are working on the same thing, working to generate political will. But we have a second purpose. And that is to empower you to have breakthroughs in your personal and political power. To empower you to have breakthroughs in your personal and political power. So again, we say the answer to what's happening is a human answer. And so we think you having breakthroughs in your personal and political power is the exact answer we need. Now, if we say that's what we need, I think I have a little bit of an obligation to clarify what I mean by the word power. So I want to see if I can elaborate on that just a touch. So this is something that I obviously have been carrying around for a while. You think one can find a new copy of it, but no. So this is a gentleman by the name of Charles Reich wrote this from something he wrote called Power and the Law. He said, power means to me pretty much the same thing as freedom. Power is the thing everybody wants the most they can possibly have of. That is, skiing is power, sex appeal is power. The ability to make yourself heard by your congressperson is power. Anything that comes out of you and goes into the world is power. And in addition to that, the ability to be open, to appreciate, to receive love, to respond to others, to listen to music, to understand literature. All of that is power. By power, I mean human faculties exercised to the largest possible degree. So in a way, in a large sense, by power, I mean individual intelligence. Now, when you reach out to another person through the energy or creativity that is in you, and that other person responds, you're exercising power. I think he wrote all that so he could write this last line. He says, when you make somebody else do something against their will, to me, that is not power at all, that is force. And force to me is the negation of power. He says, when you make somebody else do something against their will, to me, that is not power at all. That is force, and force to me is a negation of power. That's the heart of what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to beat people over the head. We're not going to go to meetings and yell at them. We're going to see if we can't reach them in a way that brings them along and find common ground and commonality with anybody. Okay, which brings us to our next exercise. I suspect there have been times in your life where you've experienced force with other people. Either you trying to get something done by being forceful, or someone was forceful with you. On the other hand, I suspect there's been time where you've actually experienced power, where it didn't have anything to do with force. It had to be with something way more interesting than being forceful. Either something you were doing or someone else was doing. So I'd like you to pair up with the person you spoke with previously and identify what is something that you noticed in your life where either power or force, or you saw the contrast. So go ahead and see if you can identify an example where you experienced either one or the other, or if you come up with both, that's fine also. So pair up with the person you were paired up with before and share an example of either force or power or both. Go ahead.